The Reformation by Will Durant. Part 1. Continued. Cassette 3, Side 2. Morals were such as any country might expect from so long and tragic a disablement of economy and government. Geoffrey de la Tour-Landry, about 1372, wrote 2 books to guide his children in the chaos. Only that which he addressed to his daughters survives. It is a gentle and tender volume, warm with parental love, and disturbed by solicitude for a virginity especially unstable in a time when many women came through generous sins to ungenerous contumely. Against such temptations, the good knight thought, the best protection was frequent prayer. The book reflects an age still clinging to civilized sentiments and moral sense. 70 years later, we come to the gruesome figure of the Maréchal de Retz, or Retz, a great and wealthy lord of Brittany. It was his custom to invite children into his castle on pretense of training them for the chapel choir. One by one he killed them and offered them in sacrifice to demons, of whom he begged magic powers. But also he killed for pleasure, and, we are told, laughed at the cries of his tortured or dying choristers. For 14 years he followed this routine, until at last the father of a victim dared to indict him. He confessed all these details and was hanged in 1440, but only because he had offended the Duke of Brittany. Men of his rank could seldom be brought to justice, whatever their crimes. Yet the aristocracy to which he belonged produced heroes in abundance, like King John of Bohemia or the Gaston Phoebus de Foix, so loved and lauded by Froissart. The final flowers of chivalry blossomed in this mire. The morality of the people shared in the common debacle. Cruelty, treachery, and corruption were endemic. Commoner and governor were alike open to bribes. Profanity flourished. Chancellor Gerson complained that the most sacred festivals were passed in card-playing, gambling, and blasphemy. Sharpers, forgers, thieves, vagabonds, and beggars clogged the streets by day and gathered at night to enjoy their gleanings, at Paris, in the Cour des Miracles, so called because the mendicants who had posed as cripples during the day appeared there marvelously sound in every limb. Sodomy was frequent, prostitution was general, adultery was almost universal. A sect of Adamites in the 14th century advocated nudism and practiced it in public till the Inquisition suppressed them. Obscene pictures were as widely marketed as now. According to Gerson, they were sold even in churches and on holy days. Poets like Deschamps wrote erotic ballads for noble dames. Nicolas de Clémanges, Archdeacon of Bayeux, described the convents of his district as sanctuaries devoted to the cult of Venus. It was taken as a matter of course that kings and princes should have mistresses, since royal, and many noble, marriages were political matches involving, it was held, no due of love. High-born ladies continued to hold formal discussions on the casuistry of sexual relations. Philip the Bold of Burgundy established a court of love in Paris in 1401. Amid or beneath this moneyed laxity there were presumably some virtuous women and honest men. We catch a fleeting glimpse of them in a strange book written about 1393 by an anonymous sexagenarian known as the ménagier, or householder, of Paris. I believe that when 2 good and honorable people are wed, all loves are put off, save only the love of each for the other. And meseems that when they are in each other's presence, they look upon each other more than upon the others. They clasp and hold each other, and they do not willingly speak and make signs, save to each other. And all their special pleasure, their chief desire and perfect joy, is to do pleasure or obedience one to the other. Persecutions of Jews, 1306, 1384, 1396, and lepers, 1321, trials and executions of animals for injuring or copulating with human beings, public hangings that drew immense crowds of eager spectators, entered into the picture of the age. In the cemetery of the Church of the Innocents at Paris, so many newly dead sought admission that bodies were exhumed as soon as the flesh might be expected to have fallen from the bones. The bones were indiscriminately piled in charnel houses alongside the cloisters. Nevertheless, these cloisters were a popular rendezvous, Shops were set up there, and prostitutes invited patronage. On a wall of the cemetery, an artist labored for months in 1424 to paint a dance of death, in which demons, pirouetting with men, women, and children, led them step by merry step to hell. This became a symbolic theme of a desperate age. A play presented it at Bruges in 1449. Dürer, Holbein, and Bosch would illustrate it in their art. Pessimism wrote half the poetry of the period. Deschamps reviled life in almost all its parts. The world seemed to him like a weak, timorous, covetous old man, confused and decayed. All goes badly, he concluded. Gerson agreed with him. We lived in the senility of the world, and the last judgment was near. An old woman thought that every twitch of pain in her toes announced another soul heaved into hell. Her estimate was moderate. According to popular belief, no one had entered paradise in the past 30 years. What did religion do in this collapse of an assaulted nation? In the first 4 decades of the 100 Years' War, the popes, immured at Avignon, received the protection and commands of the French kings. Much of the revenues drawn from Europe by the popes of that captivity went to those kings to finance the struggle of life and death against Britain. In 11 years, from 1345 to 1355, the Church advanced 3,392 florins, or about $84,800,000, to the monarchy. The popes tried again and again to end the war, but failed. The Church suffered grievously from the century-long devastation of France. Hundreds of churches and monasteries were abandoned or destroyed, and the lower clergy shared in the demoralization of the age. Knights and footmen ignored religion until the hour of battle or death, and must have felt some qualms of greed at the maddening indifference of the skies. The people, while breaking all the commandments, clung fearfully to the Church and the faith. They brought their pennies and their griefs to the comforting shrines of the Mother of God. They rose en masse to religious ecstasy at the earnest preaching of Friar Richard or St. Vincent Ferrer. Some houses had statuettes of the Virgin so contrived that a touch would open her abdomen and reveal the Trinity. The intellectual leaders of the Church in this period were mostly Frenchmen. Pierre d'Ailly was not only one of the most suggestive scientists of the time, he was among the ablest and most incorruptible leaders of the Church. And he was one of the ecclesiastical statesmen who, at the Council of Constance, healed the schism in the papacy. As director of the College of Navarre in Paris, he had among his pupils a youth who became the outstanding theologian of his generation. Jean de Gerson visited the lowlands and was much impressed by the mysticism of Ruysbroek and the moderna devotio of the Brethren of the Common Life. When he became Chancellor of the University of Paris in 1395, he sought to introduce this form of piety into France, even while censuring the egoism and pantheism of the mystic school. His 6 sisters were overcome by his arguments and example, and we are told that they remained virgins to the end of their lives. Gerson condemned the superstitions of the populace and the quackeries of astrology, magic, and medicine, but he admitted that charms may have efficacy by working upon the imagination. Our knowledge of the stars, he thought, was too imperfect to allow specific predictions. We cannot even reckon a solar year precisely. We cannot tell the true positions of the stars because their light is refracted, as it passes down to us, through a variety of mediums. Gerson advocated a limited democracy and the supremacy of the councils in the Church, but favored a strong monarchy in France. Perhaps his inconsistency was justified by the condition of his country, which needed order more than liberty. He was a great man in his fashion and generation. His virtues, as Goethe would have said, were his own attainment, while his delusions were infections from the age. He led the movement to depose rival popes and reform the Church, and he shared in sending John Hus and Jerome of Prague to the stake. Amid the destitution of their people, the upper classes glorified their persons and adorned their homes. Common men wore simple jerkins, blouses, culottes or trousers, and high boots. The middle classes, imitating the kings despite sumptuary laws, wore long robes, perhaps dyed in scarlet or edged with fur. Noble lords wore doublets and long hose, handsome capes, and feathered hats that swept the earth in courtly bows. Some men wore horns on the toes of their shoes to correspond with less visible emblems on their heads. High-born ladies affected conical hats like church steeples, straightened themselves in tight jackets and colorful pantaloons, trailed furry skirts over the floor majestically, and graciously displayed their bosoms while enhancing their faces with veils. Buttons were coming into fashion for fastenings, having before been merely ornaments. We are reversing that movement now. Silks, cloth of gold, brocade, lace, jewelry in the hair, on neck and hands and dress and shoes, made even stout women sparkle. And under this protective brilliance nearly all upper-class women developed a Rubensian amplitude. The homes of the poor remained as in former centuries, except that glass windows were now general. But the villas and townhouses, or hotels, of the rich were no longer gloomy donjons. They were commodious and well-furnished mansions, with spacious fountained courts, broad winding stairs, overhanging balconies, and sharply sloping roofs that cut the sky and sloughed the snow. They were equipped with servants' rooms, storerooms, guard-room, porter's room, linen room, laundry, wine cellar, and bakery, in addition to the great hall and bedrooms of the master's family. Some chateaux, like those of Pierrefonds, circa 1390, and Châteaudun, circa 1450, already presaged the regal castles of the Loire. Better preserved than any palace of the time is the house of the great capitalist Jacques Coeur at Bourges, a full block long, with Gothic tower of carved stone, ornate cornices and reliefs, and Renaissance windows. The whole costing, we are told, some $4 million in the money of today. Interiors were now sumptuously furnished. Magnificent fireplaces, which could warm at least one side of a room and its occupants, sturdy chairs and tables indefatigably carved, cushioned benches along tapestried walls, gigantic dressers and cupboards displaying gold and silver plate, and far lovelier glass, thick carpets and floors of polished oak or enameled tiles, and high canopied beds vast enough to hold the lord, his lady, and a child or two. On these recumbent thrones the men and women of the 14th and 15th centuries slept naked. Nightgowns were not yet an indispensable impediment. 7. Letters. Among the ruins, men and women continued to write books. The Postulae Perpetuae, of 1322 to 1331, by Nicholas of Lyra, were major contributions to the textual understanding of the Bible, and prepared the way for Erasmus's New Testament and Luther's German translation. The fiction of the period favored light erotic tales like the Cent Nouvelles Nouvelles, 100 novel novels, of Antoine de La Salle, or romances of chivalry like Flore et Blanchefleur. Almost as fictitious was the book of a Liège physician, Jean à la Barbe, who called himself Sir John Mandeville, and published, circa 1370, an account of his alleged travels in Egypt, Asia, Russia, and Poland. John claimed to have visited all the places named in the Gospels: the house where the sweet Virgin went to school, the spot where the water was warmed with which our Lord washed the feet of the apostles, the church in which Mary hid herself to draw milk from her worthy breasts. In this same church is a marble column against which she leaned, and which is still moist from her milk. And wherever her worthy milk fell, the earth is still soft and white. John of the Beard is at his best in describing China, where his eloquence was least cramped by erudition. Now and then he verges on science, as when he tells how a man traveled ever eastward until he came to his own country again, like Jules Verne's Monsieur Passepartout. He drank twice at the Fountain of Youth, but returned to Europe, crippled with arthritis, which perhaps he caught by never leaving Liège. These travels, translated into 100 languages, became one of the literary sensations of the later Middle Ages. By far the most brilliant production of French literature in the 14th century was the Chronicles of Jean Froissart. Born at Valenciennes in 1338, he lapsed into poetry at an early age, and at 24 he crossed to London to lay his verses at the feet of Edward III's wife, Philippa of Hainaut. He became her secretary, met English aristocrats, and admired them too frankly to be impartial in his history. Lust for travel soon uprooted him and drew him to Scotland, Bordeaux, Savoy, and Italy. Returning to Hainaut, he became a priest and canon of Chimay. Now he decided to rewrite his book in prose and to extend it at both ends. He traveled again in England and France, sedulously gathering material. Back in Chimay, he dedicated himself to finishing this noble and pleasant history, which will be much in request when I am gone, to encourage all valorous hearts and to show them honorable examples. No romance could be more fascinating. He who begins these 1,200 ample pages with intent to leap from peak to peak will find the valleys inviting too, and will move gladly and leisurely to the end. This priest, like Julius II, loved nothing so much as war. He was allured by action, gallantry, aristocracy. Commoners enter his pages only as victims of lordly strife. He did not inquire into motives. He relied too trustfully on embellished or prejudiced accounts. He made no pretense of adding philosophy to narrative. He was only a chronicler, but of all chroniclers the best. Drama marked time. Mysteries, moralities, miracles, interludes, and farces occupied the stages temporarily erected in the towns. Themes were increasingly secular, and the humor was often scandalous, but religious subjects still predominated, and the people never tired of spectacles representing the Passion of Christ. The most famous theatre guild of the time, the Parisian Confrérie de la Passion de Notre Seigneur, specialized in acting the story of Christ's brief stay in Jerusalem. One such passion play by Arnoul Grobin ran to 35,000 lines. Poetry, too, had its guilds. Toulouse set up in 1323 a Consistorie de la Gaie Science, or Academy of the Gay Science. Under its auspices, public competitions in poetry sought to revive the art and spirit of the troubadours. Similar literary societies were formed at Amiens, Douai, and Valenciennes, preparing for the French Academy of Richelieu. Kings and great lords had poets as well as minstrels and buffoons attached to their households. The good René, Duke of Anjou and Lorraine, and titular King of Naples, supported a bevy of poets and artists at his courts in Nancy, Tarascon, and Aix-en-Provence, and so rivaled the best of his rhymers that he received the title of Last of the Troubadours. Charles V took care of Eustache Deschamps, who sang the beauty of women, married, denounced matrimony in a 12,000-line Le Miroir de la Mariage, and bemoaned the misery and wickedness of his time. O age of lead, perverse time, sky of brass, land without fruit, sterile and profitless, people accursed, with every sorrow full. Is it not right that I should mourn you all? For I see nothing in tomorrow's world, grievously sad and all disorderly, comprising every evil in its deeds. Today the time of tribulation comes. Christine de Pizan, reared in Paris as the daughter of Charles V's Italian physician, was left with 3 children and 3 relatives to support when her husband died. She did it miraculously by writing exquisite poetry and patriotic history. She deserves a passing obeisance as the first woman in Western Europe to live by her pen. Alain Chartier was more fortunate. His love poems, like La Belle Dame sans Merci, which melodiously chided women for hoarding their charms, so captivated the aristocracy that a future Queen of France, Margaret of Scotland, was said to have kissed the lips of the poet as he slept on a bench. Etienne Pasquier, a century later, told the legend charmingly. When many were astonished at this, for to speak the truth, nature had placed a beautiful spirit in a most ungraceful body, the lady told them they must not be surprised at this mystery, for it was not the man whom she desired to kiss, but the lips whence had issued such golden words. The finest French poet of the age did not have to write poetry, for he was the nephew of Charles VI and the father of Louis XII. But Charles, Duke of Orleans, was taken prisoner at Agincourt, and spent 25 years, from 1415 to 1440, in genteel captivity in England. There, heavy of heart, he consoled himself by writing tender verses about the beauty of women and the tragedy of France. For a time all France sang his song of spring. The year has changed his mantle cold, of wind, of rain, of bitter air, and he goes clad in cloth of gold, of laughing sun and season fair. No bird or beast or wood or wold, but doth with cry or song declare, the year lays down his mantle cold. Even in England there were pretty girls, and Charles forgot his griefs when modest loveliness passed by. O God, how good it is to see her, gracious one, so good and fair! For all choice virtues that are in her, each will offer praises rare. Who then can weary of her beauty, fresh each day beyond compare? O God, how good it is to see her, gracious one, so good and fair! Allowed at last to return to France, he made his castle at Blois a happy centre of literature and art, where Villon was received despite his poverty and his crimes. When old age came and Charles could no longer join in the revels of his young friends, he made his excuses to them in graceful lines that might have served as his epitaph. Salute for me all the company, where now you meet in camaraderie, and say how gladly I would be one of their band if it could be. Age holds me in captivity. In time long past, youth joyously governed my life. Gone now is he. Lover was I, ne'er more must be. In Paris, led a life so free. Goodbye, good times I ne'er shall see. Salute for me all the company. (8) Art. The artists of France were in this epoch superior to her poets, but they too suffered from her bitter impoverishment. No lavish patronage supported them, of city, church, or king. The communes, which had expressed the pride of their guilds through majestic temples to an unquestioned faith, had been weakened or destroyed by the extension of royal authority and the enlargement of the economy from a local to a national frame. The French church could no longer finance or inspire such stupendous structures as had risen in the 12th and 13th centuries from the soil of France. Faith as well as wealth had declined. The hope that in those centuries had undertaken at once the Crusades and the cathedrals, the enterprise and its prayer, had lost its generative ecstasy. It was more than the 14th century could do to finish, in architecture, what a more sanguine era had begun. Even so, Jean Ravis completed Notre Dame in Paris in 1351. Rouen added a Lady Chapel in 1302 to a cathedral already dedicated to Our Lady, and Poitiers gave her cathedral its proud west front in 1379. The Rayonnant style of Gothic design was now, from 1275 onward, gradually yielding to a geometrical Gothic that stressed Euclidean figures instead of radiating lines. In this manner, Bordeaux built her cathedral from 1320 to 1325. Caen raised a handsome spire, shattered in the Second World War, on the Church of Saint-Pierre in 1308. Auxerre gave her cathedral a new nave in 1335. Coutances, 1371 to 1386, and Amiens in 1375 added lovely chapels to their historic shrines, and Rouen enhanced her architectural glory with the noble church of Saint-Ouen from 1318 to 1545. In the final quarter of the 14th century, when France thought herself victorious, her architects displayed a new Gothic, joyous in spirit, exuberant in carved detail, fancifully intricate in tracery, reveling recklessly in ornament. The ogive, or pointed arch of a continued curve, became now an ogee, or tapered arch of a reversed curve, like the tongue of flame that gave the style its flamboyant name. Capitals fell into disuse. Columns were fluted or spiraled. Choir stalls were profusely carved and were closed with iron screens of delicate lacery. Pendentives became stalactites. Vaults were a wilderness of intertwined, disappearing, reappearing ribs. The mullions of the windows shunned the old solid geometrical forms and flowed in charming frailty and incalculable willfulness. Spires seemed built of decoration. Structures vanished behind ornament. The new style made its debut in the chapel of Saint Jean-Baptiste in 1375 and the Cathedral of Amiens. By 1425 it had captured France. In 1436 it began one of its fragile miracles, the church of Saint-Maclou at Rouen. Perhaps the revival of French courage and arms by Joan of Arc and Charles VII, the growth of mercantile wealth as instanced by Jacques Coeur, and the inclination of the rising bourgeoisie to luxurious ornament helped the flamboyant style to its triumph in the first half of the 15th century. In that feminine form, Gothic survived till French kings and nobles brought back from their wars in Italy the classical architectural ideas of the Renaissance. The growth of civil architecture revealed the rising secularism of the time. Kings and dukes thought there were churches enough and built themselves palaces to impress the people and house their mistresses. Rich burghers spent fortunes on their homes. Municipalities announced their wealth through splendid hôtels de ville or city halls. Some hospitals, like Beaune's, were designed with a fresh and airy beauty that must have lulled the ill to health. At Avignon, the popes and cardinals gathered and nourished a diversity of artists, but the builders, painters, and sculptors of France were now usually grouped about a noble or a king. Charles V built the Château of Vincennes from 1364 to 73, and the Bastille in 1369, and commissioned the versatile André Bonneveau to carve figures of Philip VI, John II, and Charles himself for the imposing array of royal tombs that crowd the ambulatory and crypt of Saint-Denis, this in 1364. Louis of Orléans raised the Château of Pierrefonds, and John, Duke of Berry, though hard on his peasants, was one of the great art patrons of history. For him, Bonneveau illustrated a Psalter in 1402. It was but one in a series of illuminated manuscripts that stand near the top in what might be called the chamber music of the graphic arts. For the same discriminating lord, Jacquemart de Hedin painted Les Petites Heures, Les Belles Heures, and Les Grandes Heures, all illustrating books of hours for the canonical daily prayers. Again for Duke John, the brothers Paul, Jeannequin, and Hermant Maluel of Limburg produced Les Tres Richeurs in 1416, 65 delicately beautiful miniatures picturing the life and scenery of France. Nobles hunting, peasants working, a countryside purified with snow. These very rich hours, now hidden even from tourist eyes in the Condé Museum at Chantilly, and the miniatures made for Le Bon Roi, René of Anjou, were almost the last triumphs of illumination. For in the 15th century that art was challenged both by woodblock engraving and by the development of thriving schools of mural and easel painting at Fontainebleau, Amiens, Bourges, Tours, Moulins, Avignon, and Dijon, not to speak of the masters who worked for the Dukes of Burgundy. Bonneveau and the Van Eycks brought Flemish styles of painting to France, and through Simone Martini and other Italians at Avignon and the Angevin rule in Naples, from 1268 to 1435, Italian art influenced the French long before French arms invaded Italy. By 1450, French painting stood on its own feet, and marked its coming of age with the anonymous Pietà of Villeneuve, now in the Louvre. Jean Fouquet is the first clear personality in French painting. Born at Tours in 1416, he studied for 7 years in Italy from 1440 to 1447, and returned to France with that predilection for classical architectural backgrounds which in the 17th century would become a mania with Nicolas Poussin and Claude Lorrain. Nevertheless, he painted several portraits that are powerful revelations of character. Archbishop Juvenal des Ursins, Chancellor of France, stout and stern and resolute, and not too pious for statesmanship. Etienne Chevalier, treasurer of the realm, a melancholy man troubled by the impossibility of raising money as fast as a government can spend it. Charles VII himself, after Agnès Sorel had made a man of him, and Agnès in the rosy flesh, transformed by Fouquet into a cold and stately virgin with downcast eyes and uplifted breast. For Chevalier, Jean illuminated a Book of Hours, brightening the tedium of ritual prayer with almost fragrant scenes from the valley of the Loire. An enameled medallion in the Louvre preserves Fouquet as he saw himself, no princely Raphael riding high, but a simple artisan of the brush, dressed for work, eager and diffident, worried and resolved, bearing the mark of a century of poverty on his brow. However, he passed without mishap from one reign to another, and rose at last to be peintre du roi for the incalculable Louis XI. After many years of labor comes success, and soon thereafter death. 9. Joan of Arc, 1412 to 1431. In 1422, the repudiated son of Charles VI had himself proclaimed king as Charles VII. In her desolation, France looked to him for help, and fell into deeper despair. This timid, listless, heedless youth of 20 hardly credited his own proclamation, and probably shared the doubts of Frenchmen as to the legitimacy of his birth. Fouquet's portrait of him shows a sad and homely face, pockets under the eyes, and an overreaching nose. He was fearfully religious, heard 3 masses daily, and allowed no canonical hour to pass without reciting its appointed prayers. In the intervals he attended to a long succession of mistresses, and begot 12 children upon his virtuous wife. He pawned his jewels, and most of the clothes from his back, to finance resistance to England, but he had no stomach for war, and left the struggle to his ministers and his generals. Neither were they enthusiastic or alert. They quarreled jealously among themselves, all but the faithful Jean Dunois, the natural son of Louis, Duke of Orleans. When the English moved south to lay siege to that city in 1428, no concerted action was taken to resist them, and disorder was the order of the day. Orleans lay at a bend in the Loire. If it fell, all the south, now hesitantly loyal to Charles VII, would join the north to make France an English colony. North and south alike watched the siege and prayed for a miracle. Even the distant village of Domremy, half asleep by the Meuse on the eastern border of France, followed the struggle with patriotic and religious passion. The peasants there were fully medieval in faith and sentiment. They lived from nature, but in the supernatural. They were sure that spirits dwelled in the surrounding air, and many women vowed that they had seen and talked with them. Men as well as women there, as generally throughout rural France, thought of the English as devils who hid their tails in their coat-tails. Some day, said a prophecy current in the village, God would send a Pucelle, a virgin maid, to save France from these demons, and end the long satanic reign of war. The wife of the mayor of Domremy whispered these hopes to her goddaughter Joan. Joan's father, Jacques d'Arc, was a prosperous farmer, and probably gave no mind to such tales. Joan was noted among these pious people for her piety. She was fond of going to church, confessed regularly and fervently, and busied herself with parochial charities. In her little garden the fowls and the birds ate from her hand. One day, when she had been fasting, she thought she saw a strange light over her head, and that she heard a voice saying, "Jeanne, be a good obedient child. Go often to church." She was then, 1424, in her 13th year. Perhaps some physiological changes mystified her at this most impressionable time. During the next 5 years, her voices, as she called the apparitions, spoke many counsels to her, until at last it seemed to her that the Archangel Michael himself commanded her, "Go to the succor of the King of France, and thou shalt restore his kingdom. Go to Monsieur Baudricourt, captain at Vaucouleurs, and he will conduct thee to the king." And at another time the voice said, "Daughter of God, thou shalt lead the Dauphin to Reims, that he may there receive worthily his anointing and coronation." For until Charles should be anointed by the Church, France would doubt his divine right to rule. But if the holy oil should be poured upon his head, France would unite behind him and be saved. After a long and troubled hesitation, Joan revealed her visions to her parents. Her father was shocked at the thought of an innocent girl undertaking so fantastic a mission. Rather than permit it, he said, he would drown her with his own hands. To further restrain her, he persuaded a young villager to announce that she had promised him her hand in marriage. She denied it, and to preserve the virginity that she had pledged to her saints, as well as to obey their command, she fled to an uncle and prevailed upon him to take her to Vaucouleurs. This in 1429. There, Captain Baudricourt advised the uncle to give the 17-year-old girl a good spanking and to restore her to her parents. But when Joan forced her way into his presence and firmly declared that she had been sent by God to help King Charles save Orleans, the bluff commandant melted, and even while thinking her charmed by devils, sent to Chinon to ask the king's pleasure. Royal permission came. Baudricourt gave the maid a sword. The people of Vaucouleurs bought her a horse, and 6 soldiers agreed to guide her on the long and perilous journey across France to Chinon. Perhaps to discourage male advances, to facilitate riding, and to win acceptance by generals and troops, she donned a masculine and military garb, jerkin, doublet, hose, gaiters, spurs, and cut her hair like a boy's. She rode serene and confident through towns that vacillated between fearing her as a witch and worshipping her as a saint. After traveling 450 miles in 11 days, she came to the king and his council. Though his poor raiment gave no sign of royalty, Joan, we are told, for how could legend keep its hands from her history, singled him out at once and greeted him courteously. "God send you long life, gentle Dauphin. My name is Jean le Pucelle. The King of Heaven speaks to you through me, and says that you shall be anointed and crowned at Reims, and be lieutenant of the King of Heaven, who is King of France." A priest who now became the maid's chaplain said later that in private she assured the king of his legitimate birth. Some have thought that from her first meeting with Charles she accepted the clergy as the rightful interpreters of her voices, and followed their lead in her counsel to the king. Through her the bishops might displace the generals in forming the royal policies. Still doubtful, Charles sent her to Poitiers to be examined by pundits there. They found no evil in her. They commissioned some women to inquire into her virginity, and on that delicate point, too, they were satisfied. For, like the maid, they held that a special privilege belonged to virgins as the instruments and messengers of God. Dunois, in Orléans, had assured the garrison that God would soon send someone to their aid. Hearing of Joan, he half believed his hopes, and pleaded with the court to send her to him at once. They consented, gave her a black horse, clothed her in white armor, put in her hand a white banner embroidered with the fleur-de-lis of France, and dispatched her to Dunois with a numerous escort bearing provisions for the besieged. It was not hard to find entry to the city, this on April 29, 1429. The English had not surrounded it entirely, but had divided their 2,000 or 3,000 men, less than the Orléans garrison, among a dozen forts at strategic points in the environs. The people of Orléans held Joan as the Virgin incarnate, followed her trustfully even into dangerous places, accompanied her to church, prayed when she prayed, wept when she wept. At her command the soldiers gave up their mistresses and struggled to express themselves without profanity. One of their leaders, La Hire, found this impossible, and received from Joan a dispensation to swear by his baton. It was this Gascon condottiere who uttered the famous prayer, "Sire God, I beg thee to do for La Hire what he would do for thee, wert thou a captain and La Hire were God." Joan sent a letter to Talbot, the English commander, proposing that both armies should unite as brothers and proceed to Palestine to redeem the Holy Land from the Turks. Talbot thought that this exceeded his commission. Some days later, a part of the garrison, without informing Dunois or Joan, issued beyond the walls and attacked one of the British bastions. The English fought well, the French retreated, but Dunois and Joan, having heard the commotion, rode up and bade their men renew the assault. It succeeded, and the English abandoned their position. On the morrow, the French attacked 2 other forts and took them, the maid being in the thick of the fight. In the second encounter, an arrow pierced her shoulder. When the wound had been dressed, she returned to the fray. Meanwhile, the sturdy cannon of Guillaume d'Ussy hurled upon the English fortress of Les Tourelles balls weighing 120 pounds each. Joan was spared the sight of the victorious French slaughtering 500 Englishmen when that stronghold fell. Talbot concluded that his forces were inadequate for the siege, and withdrew them to the north on May 8th. All France rejoiced, seeing in the Maid of Orléans the hand of God. But the English denounced her as a sorceress, and vowed to take her alive or dead. On the day after her triumph, Joan set out to meet the king, who was advancing from Chinon. He greeted her with a kiss, and accepted her plan to march through France to Reims, though this meant passing through hostile terrain. His army encountered English forces at Meung, Beaugency, and Patay, and won decisive victories, tarnished with vengeful massacres that horrified the Maid. Seeing a French soldier slay an English prisoner, she dismounted, held the dying man's head in her hands, comforted him, and sent for a confessor. On July 15th, the king entered Reims, and on the 17th he was anointed and crowned with awesome ceremonies in the majestic cathedral. Jacques d'Arc, coming up from Domremy, saw his daughter, still in her male attire, riding in splendor through the religious capital of France. He did not neglect the occasion, but through her intercession secured a remission of taxes for his village. For a passing spell, Joan considered her mission accomplished, and thought, if it would please God that I might go and tend sheep with my sister and brother. But the fever of battle had entered her blood. Acclaimed as inspired and holy by half of France, she almost forgot now to be a saint, and became a warrior. She was strict with her soldiers, scolded them lovingly, and deprived them of the consolations that all soldiers hold as their due. and when she found two prostitutes accompanying them, she drew her sword and struck one so manfully that the blade broke and the woman died. She followed the king and his army in an attack upon Paris, which was still held by the English. She was in the van in clearing the first fosse. Approaching the second, she was struck in the thigh by an arrow, but remained to cheer on the troops. Their assault failed. They suffered 1,500 casualties and cursed her for thinking that a prayer could silence a gun. This had not been their experience. Some Frenchwomen, who had jealously waited for her first reverse, censured her for leading an assault on the Feast of the Virgin's Birth, September 8, 1429. She retired with her detachment to Compiègne. Besieged there by Burgundians allied with the English, she bravely led a sally which was repulsed. She was the last to retreat and found the gates of the town closed before she could reach them. She was dragged from her horse and was taken as a captive to John of Luxembourg on May 24, 1430. Sir John lodged her honorably in his castles at Beaulieu and Beaurevoir. His good fortune brought him a dangerous dilemma. His sovereign, Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy, demanded the precious prize. The English urged Sir John to surrender her to them, hoping that her ignominious execution would break the charm that had so heartened the French. Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, who had been driven from his diocese for supporting the English, was sent by them to Philip with powers and funds to negotiate the transfer of the Maid to British authority, and was promised the Archbishopric of Rouen as the reward of his success. The Duke of Bedford, controlling the University of Paris, induced its pundits to advise Philip to hand over Joan, as a possible sorceress and heretic, to Cauchon as the ecclesiastical head of the region in which she had been captured. When these arguments were rejected, Cauchon offered to Philip and John a bribe of 10,000 gold crowns, or $250,000. This, too, proving inadequate, the English government laid an embargo on all exports to the Low Countries. Flanders, the richest source of the Duke's revenue, faced bankruptcy. John, over the entreaties of his wife, and Philip, despite his good name, finally accepted the bribe and surrendered the maid to Cauchon, who took her to Rouen. There, though formerly a prisoner of the Inquisition, she was placed under English guard in the tower of a castle held by the Earl of Warwick as the governor of Rouen. Shackles were put on her feet, and a chain was fastened around her waist and bound to a beam. Her trial began on February 21st, 1431, and continued till May 30th. This book is continued on Cassette 4, Side 1.